Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines on cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impacts these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. Joining us today, we have a woman who is a true powerhouse. She is past chair of the NCIA, on the board of the Cannabis Alliance of Washington State. She serves on the steering committee for Green Flower Media, on the board of The Farm in Boulder, Colorado, as well as advisory board for Extraction Magazine. And you may have seen her on the documentary Women of Weed. And in her spare time, she currently serves as CEO of Eden Labs. Please welcome AC Braddock. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, I know your time is valuable, so we appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us. And our next guest is needs no introduction. He's my partner in crime on here. He is our Chief Knowledge Officer here at New Frontier Data. Please welcome back Mr. John Kagia.
Delighted to be back, Heather. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. So before we get started, AC, would you mind giving our listeners just a quick download of Eden Labs and your work there? And particularly, I know that you had a lot to do with the envision of extraction in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, actually, Eden is a 26-year-old botanical extraction company at this point. And yes, we have been doing cannabis that entire time. It's always the first question. And a lot of other botanicals too, but our founder, Fritz just got really interested in all kinds of medicinal botanicals back in the 90s and looked around for extraction systems, and what he saw was generally overpriced, too many bells and whistles, flaky service. So he just built his own, and that morphed into him supplying commercial scale systems to California in 1996 when 215 passed. He primarily focused on ethanol and supercritical CO2, but we also do a number of other different solvents, particularly with other botanicals. And we have a patent on a CO2 propane mix, which we're getting ready to launch. But I went about in 2009 when I came on as CEO. It was really obvious to me that the few states that were legalizing were obviously legalizing on medical, and we weren't going to be able to continue to legalize faster without healthy concentrates. So that's when we really started pushing CO2, which is primarily what's used in pharmaceutical and nutraceutical industries. And during all that time, obviously, you have to be very, very involved in politics, and you still do, because we are in prohibition still.
Right. Well, it seems like you have been, I feel like I talk about the cannabis industry is like dog years. You're in it for 2 years, it feels like 10. So you guys have been in it for
a lifetime.
I know. That is fantastic. Well, we have a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. MJBizDaily.com reported extraction methods affect cannabinoid composition and may affect biological activity. AC, when it comes to extraction, just how important is consistent extraction methodology and standardized cannabinoid concentrations?
I would say that it's very important from the consumer end to always know what they're getting. But I also think that we can allow for some wiggle room in a percentage or range. I don't think it has to be precise like pharmaceuticals, because we've been utilizing cannabis for thousands and thousands of years. There's never been a recorded death from it. So the reason why I say it could be a range is because I think it's important that the end product replicate the plant as much as possible. And if we're doing that, then we're really working from genetics, plant genetics to human genetics, and having a 5 or 10% difference from one batch to the next. I don't see that as a big deal. And I think it's obviously you can get it to 5% or less. That's wonderful.
Has the consistency been an issue in the past of having large inconsistencies between them?
Yes. And then I think that in the past, people have segmented out cultivation with processing with, product development,
Right.
when really it's all one process. So if you're paying attention to what you're growing, how you're growing, when you harvest it, how you cure it, if you cure it. I mean, like if you look at it as an entire process, then it becomes a much more controllable vertical and supply chain, that then your end product can be closer to what it is you want every time.
That's so interesting. John, what's your take on this? I know your team has done a ton of research.
Yeah, it's interesting. To AC's point, we are working with nature here, and it sometimes gets easy to forget that all of this is a plant-based economy, and so that there's, I think, perhaps too much expectation of being able to produce decimal precise precision or decimal precise products when you're dealing with a plant which is vulnerable and prone to evolution as these things do. On the cultivation side, the trend away from growing from seed to growing from clones and cuttings, where you are now duplicating genetics as opposed to allowing some of the kind of natural or organic dynamism to happen, I think has helped get tolerance levels much closer. But you speak to growers who produce outside in particular, and they'll say, just the nature of the growing season, the exposure to the elements, will stress out the plants in different ways, and so batch by batch, harvest by harvest, you do see variability there. So the first part is, dealing with nature, you are limited in how much controls you can put in plants being organic things. But I think the second piece to that, and this is also really important, is from the cannabis consumer standpoint, where particularly people who are still just in the process of making the transition from the prohibition illicit market to the legal one. I think consumers who still exist in a partly or fully unregulated market already deal with such kind of variability in what products they get, that the legal market's ability to dramatically reduce that means they're going to have a much better experience than they've had in the regulated market, even if it is not kind of Coca-Cola level of consistency. So from the consumer side, I don't think there's this push for these products to be within 1-2% tolerance levels, as long as the effects are somewhat similar to what they're expecting. I think consumers are still currently comfortable with there being variability.
I completely agree.
Would you say the same is the case for biomass? And I guess what the question really is, does a variability in genetics or farming technique translate to a more mutable product batch to batch?
The genetics, cultivation, and the biomass is critical, that it is as similar as it can be, because you're hopefully trying to replicate whatever was in there and with your end product. I mean, if you look at the wine industry, beer industry, hops, which is, cannabis's kissing cousin, beers can be fairly consistent. Wines are fairly consistent, but there is some variances, which then translates into, years or batches. No one cares. It actually makes some things more valuable.
Yeah.
Right. But having the same kinds of genetics and, having things processed the same way, or pre-processed is very important.
John, what's your take on that? Do you agree with what
Yeah, I smiled as AC mentioned vintages, because I'm just picturing a future where we'll be like, this is the 2013 sour diesel from Napa.
Isn't that lovely?
From Humboldt.
I love
It was
it.
a very good year. The fires had died down. It's a very distinct nose. So I think there's going to be an element of that where we'll start to understand and appreciate that. Particularly for outdoor grown cannabis, terroir and the environment do make for a varied experience. Perhaps not as true for product being grown indoors, but I think this is just part of the wild world of cannabis that we haven't yet fully seen how it plays out. But to AC's point, there's certainly an aspect of the market that could end up looking very similar to what we see with wines.
That's very interesting, kind of exciting.
I think it is too. I mean, it's just like all this pressure releases, like you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, we don't have to be exactly the same every year. So
it's all natural. This is lovely. Sunshine, the weather, the plant, the genetics.
I like it.
So maybe AC, this is a question for you, because the growers are bringing the products to you. How much variability are you seeing between growers who are claiming to produce the same genetics? So 2-3 growers who are all saying they're growing Blue Dream and bringing it to you for processing. How much variance are you seeing in that sort of scenario where they think it's the same genetic, but they're but is it? From what you're on the back end?
There's a wide gamut of that, and generally, what we have done and what we have trained all of our clients to do is make sure that those growers test the material before extraction, so they know exactly what's in there, so they can't come back later and say, oh, well, it should have been a 18% yield, or why is there no CBG in this, or THCV. Well, that wasn't in there to begin with. So the testing piece of it all down the line is really crucial.
Nice. Well, when we talk about extraction methods, what are some of the pros and cons of ethanol extraction and distillation?
Ethanol extraction, of course, has been around for a very, very, very long time. And it's wonderful. I mean, ethanol is what you call an exhaustive extraction. It will take everything out of a plant. There will be nothing, including the chlorophyll, nothing. Sometimes you want to leave the chlorophyll in because, it is a healthy component, but generally, most people want to have it removed. So it's good to take all that out. Doing it at ambient temperatures, typically when that happens, if you do it under very cold conditions of -20, -30, -40 in a cryo situation, then you're going to be retaining more of the terpene profile, which gets lost generally in the ambient extraction. But currently the industry is flooded with cryo extraction, particularly in the hemp world. But honestly, it really doesn't have to be. There are wonderful ways to do filtration after extraction where you don't have to use all that much energy in the chilling process, and those chillers are extremely expensive. Particularly if the end product is going to be post-processed to the point where there's no terpene profile in it anyway, and is going into edibles or capsules or something like that. If you do want to keep the terpene profile in, then cryo is definitely the way to go. I would say downside is just the expense of the solvent and storage of the solvent. There are obviously ways to clean the solvent up to reuse it, which is obviously very common. The equipment itself is pretty affordable, especially on a commercial and industrial scale, compared to say supercritical CO2 equipment. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, speaking of, how do they compare to CO2 over ethanol and vice versa? Why would someone choose one over the other?
Well, CO2 is what you call it, a tunable solvent. And you can get a very wide array of different kinds of products out of an extraction, because you're dealing with temperature, time, and pressure. And you can also do, pure terpene runs, and those terpenes come off really fast. And then you can increase temperature and pressure to do the rest of the cannabinoids. And every cannabinoid and terpene has a temperature threshold where certain cannabinoids will drop out. So if you're growing for a particular cannabinoid profile, and then you're also extracting for a particular cannabinoid profile, you can alter your end product, alter the material to get to the end product that you want, pretty consistently. And CO2 is very inexpensive as a solvent. It's extremely easy to store. You don't even have to, reuse it. You can just vent it off. So when it comes to facility costs, it is drastically reduced. And that's why the hops industry uses supercritical CO2. Again, kissing cousin to cannabis, but it is the preferred methodology because it does capture all the essences of the plant, including the terpene profiles. And I've never noticed that when you're drinking some craft beers, how similar it can smell to cannabis terpenes sometimes.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Right. So yeah, so that's that. So in big industrial operations typically use CO2 just because it's the overhead's far less. The equipment might be more in the get-go, but less people need to be there to operate it, and the costs are far less.
John, what are you seeing out there in the market?
Yeah, I was actually going to follow up first with just AC on that. So you've talked about kind of some real important distinctions there between ethanol and CO2. Ethanol on its kind of lower cost, the fact that it's already really widely used and that it gets everything, versus the tunability, even at a slight premium for the CO2. Based on where the industry is right now and your outlook, kind of which do you think will end up being the dominant way in which cannabis is extracted, or do you see there being over time sufficient room for both to remain widespread?
Well, we've already seen that the hemp industry has gravitated towards ethanol extraction, and then cannabis is still heavily into supercritical CO2, and that has a lot to do with, it's really the best methodology to create vape pens. Because it creates a nice liquid in the vape pen that's high terpene profile, and it's again tunable to be able to get whatever cannabinoids that you want in there. But yeah, we've already seen that differentiation. What I think is coming is a combination of the two, because if you have a CO2 system and an ethanol system, then that creates vast efficiencies and an enormous range of SKUs. You can make anything if you have those two methodologies, and you can use the CO2 system to do your terpene pulls and that finer cannabinoids, and then you just remove that material and put it in the ethanol system that'll extract it like that and use it for other things.
Yeah, interesting.
Are there a lot of operators out there that are currently using both systems, do you think, or is mostly people one or the other?
It's pretty much one or the other. I mean, this industry has been an extreme roller coaster, because we are still in prohibition, because of the regulatory issues. Every single state, and we have been there for every single state that's come on, it takes at least 2 years for them to figure out their rules and regulations, and then what city and what county is going to do what. And so, and then there's the costs of building out the facilities and licensing and attorneys and compliance. But so by the time, to create an operation like that, when people are making singular choices and their extraction technologies in their labs, because of the lack of financing. I mean, I think this year with what's going on in the new administration, we're seeing a lot more money coming into the industry. And I think once that starts happening, we'll really start looking at developing products and going backwards into the extraction methodology and really figuring out lean manufacturing for these products.
Well, speaking of rules and regulations, recently Delta 8 has been in the spotlight given its uncertain legal status and relatively mild psychoactive effects. What's your opinion on Delta 8 THC and its future in extraction?
Well, I think it's hysterical. I mean, it's hysterical, and it's really sad because, again, these regulators and lawmakers are coming in and creating all of this over regulation of this industry, and they have no idea what they're even regulating. I mean, who knew that we could make Delta 8? Well, we knew that, years and years ago.
But you just have to ask, we'll tell you.
But did we want to tell them? Or did we want to say, oh, no, THCA. I was shocked when the state of Virginia legalized THC and THCA. I'm like, oh, well, somebody there knows what they're doing. But, it's inevitable if you create laws and rules about something you're not terribly familiar with, there are going to be gaping loopholes. And there is a gaping loophole, and the people are speaking. This is what they want. And it is high time our legislators woke the hell up and start representing what the people want, and stop looking at this from a prohibitionist viewpoint, from the propaganda based on racism and greed. And that is pretty much the only reason why really we have a CBD market and a hemp market, and why the cannabis industry was split into two. And basically it was just like, well, we don't want to get all those children who are dying of epilepsy a little high. They only get CBD. Well, again, we knew that CBD is only effective by itself for a short amount of time, and it starts losing its efficacy. These studies were done in Israel a decade ago, or more actually. Hulam did a study on epilepsy 30, almost 40 years ago, and got tremendous results with whole plant. But nobody wanted to do the clinical trials because it's too expensive. So the entire industry has to realize that we are being driven by politics and not science. And once we can get to the point where we're an industry driven by science and medical efficacy and in the cannabinoid system and dealing with a plant system with the human system, then we will have an industry.
Well, it seems like they need people like you on their advisor panel to be walking us through all that. John, what's your thought on it? The whole Delta 8 situation and everything else?
I think if it's not Delta 8, it's going to be something else.
Right.
To AC's point, our collective literacy around the cannabis plant is still so vast. And then the collective illiteracy of most of the policymakers, most of the lawmakers who are making these decisions with very little education and on very aggressive timelines, just means that more often than not, you're going to end up with suboptimal outcomes. The challenge is we don't know yet about most of the compounds that are within this plant. And as science begins to uncover not just more compounds, but more potential applications for these, the regulatory ecosystem is going to continue to trip over itself, trying to find a way to put the next, put the next Delta 8, a way of put some bounds around the next Delta 8, and they'll just keep kind of playing, being a lagging, responsive regulator rather than one that allows room for both the market and the science to figure out where these compounds and potential products could be applied. So, there's a lot of hay being made in Delta 8 right now. And unfortunately, for those who have pinned their hopes on it, I do think we are going to see the hammer brought down by the feds and potentially some state regulators here in short order. But that's not going to resolve what I think is going to be a more foundational issue, which is we have barely scratched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential innovation that can be done around cannabis. and until we have much more investment in particularly US-based R&D. I think for some reason we listen to the science a lot more when it's homegrown, but a lot more investment in domestically based research or research and development, but also a lot more investment in educating policymakers so that the reflex isn't to kind of shut down, close down, and eliminate the ability to explore these applications, but more kind of pragmatic frameworks that allow the science to proceed. And if broadly speaking, the harms are found to be negligible, allow the free market to operate.
Yeah, I tell you, the thing that really disturbs me the most right now is there are several different moves in a few states to limit the amount of THC in products. And again, they have no idea what they're talking about, because in order to do that, that means in the processing piece, they'll have to start pulling apart all of the components to put it back together again in precise. And they're not even thinking about the complications of that and the extra added costs, because that's when you start getting into preparatory chromatography and isolating molecules. And it is extremely expensive to do that. And there's no point in it. I mean, and to your point, I mean, understanding all of the different cannabinoids in this plant, if we go down the clinical trial path, if we go down the traditional medical clinical FDA path, it will take decades to figure this out. So there is a movement in the natural products world, and as well as cannabis, to start compiling massive databases on anecdotal evidence to get around doing all those clinical trials, because small companies, herbalists, you're not, most of those clinical trials are performed to create patents. And you're not going to do that on a plant. So
right.
Nobody's going to take that expense. So there has to be other pathways for us to study what we're dealing with as far as this plant, and the hundreds of components in it, because it is absolutely criminal that it is criminal on so many different levels. But, basically, bottom line is people are dying because they don't have access to a plant. And it's horrific.
If I could just add to that, because I think when we talk about the law of unintended consequences, I think the idea of imposing THC caps could prove to be one of those that seems good in theory, but ends up eliciting a pretty robust array of unintended consequences. And I think one of the biggest potential consequences is consumers leaving the legal market to go get the high THC products from the unregulated market. It entirely undoes one of the key incentives for participating in the legal market, which is this kind of selection, this portfolio. Not every consumer is looking for the ultra high THC product, but the part of the point of the legal market is choice. And so by creating this artificial cap on product potency in the legal market, the unregulated market, which people have been perfectly happy with in many respects for a century, is not restricted to, means I think you will see in some of these high-performing markets a real risk of market egress as consumers eschew the legal market, and it ends up being really counterproductive. So this is not meant as an advocacy statement, but a practical assessment from what we've been hearing from consumers around their experience in the legal market. And choice is absolutely critical. And clearly there's demand for these high THC products because they're flying off the shelves, as they are for low THC products. While one can understand some of the reservations that may be driving, or some of the concerns that may be driving this consideration, if part of the entire concept of legalization is to disrupt, undermine, and ultimately do away with the illicit market, this could be one of the fastest ways to send consumers racing back.
Absolutely correct. And that is exactly how we get things like the vape crisis, where we have an illicit market creating products inexpensively adding things in there to thin the oil out, and then it gets too thin. People start recognizing it's too thin. They add in thickeners, and the market's then not being driven by mission-driven, science-oriented companies that understand how to create that without doing it on the cheap just for money.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say that all the illicit market is that either, because it's not. There are a lot of companies or organizations out there who are still just trying to get medicine to patients who don't have access through retail because it's too expensive for them, for the amount of cannabinoids that they need. There's also that, which again, if you're limiting the THC, that is a huge problem and completely counterintuitive to what this industry is.
Well, everything that you've contributed is amazing. We are almost out of time, but I do want to get your final thoughts on just extraction predictions, outlook for 2021 from both of you, but I'll start with AC. I just want to get your final thoughts on what you see coming down the road.
I think a lot of the primary extraction methodologies are pretty well fully developed. I think where a lot of the innovations coming in is in people's individual IPs on how they operate those systems and in combination with other things. And then in the pre-processing and post-processing methodologies. But what I hope to see is people stop focusing on how and start asking the question why. Like you're creating a product. So why are you creating the product? Is it solving a social ill? And then going backwards, is it sustainable? Is it thoughtful? Is it science-based? And then those extraction processes, do they fit in with the end goal in mind?
Thank you. John, what's your take?
So part of the reason why I think I personally am so interested in the extraction space is if you think about the way the market has evolved over the past few years, where we've gone from flower being the dominant product to flower now only accounting for about half of the share of sales in legal market, the rest of it being covered by value-added products which are based on extract-based oils. Shows that extraction now is literally accounting for about half of the products that you're seeing in dispensary sales or that are being sold to consumers in legal markets. And so the kind of critical role that one extraction is playing in bringing to consumers an entirely new portfolio of both products and experiences that they haven't seen before is critical to the legal market. I think it's part of what makes the legal market so much more competitive against the illicit market is this product innovation that the legal market has the resources to capitalize, to fund. But two, it also speaks to what I think is a very robust long-term growth opportunity, the market opportunity that extraction and derivative products will represent. So if we're currently saying that we're looking at about a $45 billion market by 2025, and that actually does not yet include New Mexico, which we've just added to the list of adult use states. If you take half of that as being extract-based products, you can begin to appreciate the scale and potential impact that this class of products are going to represent. So really, really bullish on kind of the outlook for extract and extract-based based products, and even more so on the amount of innovation that still lies ahead. I still feel like we are in, to mangle a baseball analogy, in the first inning of a marathon. So I think
you combine two different sports.
I'm in a country where we run, so but we barely scratched the tip of this iceberg on what the future gen cannabis product is going to be. It is going to start with extraction. It always will. But we're really, really excited for all that the extract space is going to make possible for this industry in the years to come.
Yeah, and then we need so much more education on the consumer end, so they know what they're getting, and every aspect of it, and can ask for it. And that's true across the board. Food, cosmetics, anything we consume. It's really important that we stay on that movement, farm to table, soil to oil, and in the product development, moving backwards.
Yeah, it sounds like the education piece needs to be with consumers, and then how you were saying with the people that are in charge of the regulations and making this policy, and in the politics level, someone needs to be up there educating those people as well.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us at CannaWeek. Listeners, please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and hit the notification bell so you don't miss another episode. If you have not already, please sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newfrontierdata.com/newsletter-sign up. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you next time.